The cowboy found the runaway bride in the blizzard at 4 in the morning, both of them trembling before a minister while angry voices gathered outside like wolves. Snow still clung to her torn wedding dress. Ice crystals melted from his beard as he gripped her cold fingers. "Do you take this woman?" Reverend Clearwater whispered, his voice barely audible above the howling wind that rattled the cabin walls. Sheriff Morse's fist hammered against the door. The wood splintered with each blow. Legal papers crinkled in his other hand, demanding entry, demanding justice, demanding the return of stolen property. Ezekiel Thornfield looked into Washington's dark eyes and saw his own desperation reflected back to broken souls who had found each other in the storm, to people with nothing left to lose except each other. "I do." Her lips moved soundlessly around the same words. The Reverend's hands shook as he pronounced them husband and wife. Their kiss tasted of snow and fear and something that might have been hope. The door burst open. Sheriff Morse stepped inside, snow swirling around his boots. 3 men followed, their faces hard as winter stone. Papers rustled in the sudden wind. "She belongs to Cornelius Blackwood, Jr., Morse announced, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Legal arrangement, binding contract." Zeke stepped forward, placing himself between Sarah and the men. "She's my wife now." The words hung in the air like smoke. Morse examined the hastily signed marriage certificate. His weathered face creased with doubt and something that might have been sympathy. "Blackwood Sr. has connections all the way to Washington," he said finally. "This won't hold them off for long." The men departed into the blizzard, leaving behind threats that lingered like the cold air that leaked through the broken doorframe. Zeke and Sarah stood in the sudden silence, married strangers bound by desperation and a piece of paper. 30 hours earlier, Zeke had been preparing to die. Not dramatically, not with violence or ceremony, just the slow fate of a man who had lost everything worth fighting for. The railroad barons had taken his family ranch through legal manipulation, claiming his Cherokee blood invalidated his land rights. His sister Mary had died of pneumonia in the harsh winter that followed, coughing up blood in a freezing shack, while he held her hand and watched hope drain from her eyes. He had been living alone in a one-room cabin ever since, drinking away his grief and rage, waiting for winter or whiskey to finish what the railroad men had started. Then he found her. Sarah lay crumpled in a snowdrift 50 yards from his door. Her wedding dress spread around her like broken wings. Hypothermia had nearly claimed her. Her lips were blue, her breathing shallow, her skin cold as river stones. Zeke carried her inside and spent 2 days bringing her back from the edge of death. Hot broth spooned between chattering teeth. Blankets warmed by the fire wrapped around her shivering frame. His own body heat shed during the worst moments. When her temperature dropped too low, she woke on the 2nd day speaking his name, though he had never told it to her. Delirium, he thought, until she opened her eyes and looked at him with perfect clarity. "Thank you," she said. Her voice carried education, careful pronunciation that spoke of books read by lamplight, words practiced in secret. Like him, she had learned to read despite a world that preferred her ignorant. Like him, she carried knowledge as both weapon and burden. The story came out, slowly over stolen conversations between caring for her injuries and tending his animals. Sarah had been promised in marriage to Cornelius Blackwood, Jr., son of a Texas plantation owner who had found new ways to bind people even after emancipation. Her father's debts would be forgiven in exchange for her hand, but she would essentially become unpaid labor on the Blackwood estate. She had stolen her wedding dress and fled north, following routes whispered about by other formerly enslaved, people seeking the freedom that paper had promised but society still denied. Zeke shared his own story reluctantly: the legal theft of his family's ranch, Mary's death, the false cattle theft charges planted by Harrison Steele to further discredit him, his Cherokee mother's traditions, abandoned after the white world, proved they offered no protection against greed and hatred. They were both educated outcasts. Both had lost everything. Both felt abandoned by a God who seemed to favor the powerful over the righteous. On the 3rd night, as wind howled around the cabin and snow piled against the windows, Sarah asked him a question that changed everything. "What would you do if they came for me?" Zeke looked up from the legal documents spread across his rough wooden table, papers that detailed his own fight to reclaim what had been stolen, letters to territorial officials who never responded, evidence that would never be heard by judges who had already decided his fate. "I would stop them," he said. How the question hung between them like a challenge. Zeke had no money for lawyers, no political connections, no family, name that commanded respect. He was wanted on false charges and living as a fugitive in his own territory. But he had one thing the railroad barons and plantation owners could not touch, one legal right that even corrupt officials had to recognize. "I would marry you," he said quietly. "Make you legally mine before they could claim you as theirs." Sarah studied his face in the firelight. "You would do that for someone you barely— No, I would do that for someone who understands what it means to lose everything." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her palm was warm now, no longer the cold flesh he had pulled from the snow. Life flowed through her fingers, and something he had forgotten was possible flowed through him. "Then we should prepare for war," she said. The next morning brought riders through the storm. They returned to the cabin as married strangers, the weight of their vows settling between them like fresh snow. Sarah gathered her torn wedding dress from the floor where she had dropped it 3 days ago. The fabric held the memory of her flight, of cold that nearly claimed her life. Zeke cleared his throat. "You can have the bed, I'll take the floor." She folded the dress carefully, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. "This is temporary. Until spring." "Until spring," he agreed. The words carried the promise of separation, but neither moved to claim their separate spaces. The cabin felt smaller now that they both occupied it legally. Every gesture required navigation around the other's presence. Morning brought the work of survival. Zeke showed Sarah how to hold his rifle, how to sight down the barrel without flinching when the stock kicked against her shoulder. Her hands were steady on the weapon. She had the focus of someone who understood that learning to fight meant learning to live. "Breathe out, slow," he said, standing behind her as she aimed at a knot in the distant fence post. "Pull the trigger." Between heartbeats, the shot echoed across the frozen landscape. The bullet splintered wood inches from her target. Again, she reloaded without being shown how. Her second shot found its mark. Zeke's horse was a half-wild mare named Dust, gray as winter sky and twice as unpredictable. Sarah approached with the patient calm of someone who had gentled wilder things than horses. She spoke softly, let Dust smell her hands, waited for permission before touching the animal's neck. "She doesn't trust easy," Zeke warned. "Neither do I." Sarah mounted without a saddle, her wedding boots finding purchase against Dust's ribs. The horse pranced but didn't buck. Woman and animal reached an understanding that bypassed words, built on mutual recognition of stubborn will. In the evenings, Sarah helped Zeke make sense of the legal papers that covered his table like fallen leaves. Her finger traced the dense paragraphs that detailed his stolen inheritance, her educated voice reading aloud the laws that had been twisted to serve corruption. "They claim your Cherokee blood invalidates the original deed," she said, lamplight casting shadows across the documents. "But here, in the territorial statute, it clearly states that blood quantum cannot be used to void existing property rights." Zeke watched her work, saw how her mind cut through legal language that had bewildered him for months. "You read like you were born to it. My father taught me. Said knowledge was the only thing they couldn't steal from us." Her voice carried the weight of loss. He was wrong about that too. They worked by firelight, reinforcing the cabin's walls with additional boards, sealing gaps that let in wind and cold. Sarah proved capable with hammer and nails, her small hands sure on the tools. They moved around each other in the confined space, learning the rhythm of shared labor. "You've done this before," Zeke observed as she drove a nail home with 3 clean strikes. "Built enough hiding places to know how." She didn't elaborate, but her words carried the history of a life spent preparing for flight. A knock at the door interrupted their work on the third evening. Zeke's hand found his rifle before Sarah's reached for hers. They had learned to move, as a unit, covering each other's vulnerable angles. Reverend Clearwater stood in the doorway, snow dusting his dark coat. His face carried news that couldn't wait for morning. "May I come in?" Sarah poured coffee while the Reverend warmed his hands by the fire. His presence filled the small space with quiet authority, the bearing of a man who had shepherded souls through darker valleys than this one. "There's something you need to know," he said finally, "about Haven Ridge." The name meant nothing to Zeke, but Sarah's cup rattled against its saucer. 30 miles north, Clearwater continued. "Families building something new, something free. They've been asking about you both." "What kind of families?" Sarah asked. "The kind that understand what you're fighting for." The Reverend's words painted a picture of formerly enslaved people pooling resources to buy land, establish businesses, create the community that emancipation had promised but never delivered. They needed teachers, protectors, people who wouldn't run when trouble came. "They're offering sanctuary," Clearwater said, "and alliance." The next morning brought their first real visitor. Doc Evelyn Harper arrived in a buggy that had seen better decades, her medical bag strapped beside her like a weapon of healing. She was a small woman with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, the territory's only female doctor and its most stubborn advocate for justice. He examined Sarah with professional thoroughness, checking for lingering effects of hypothermia and the hard travel that had brought her north. Her questions were gentle but thorough, building a picture of Sarah's flight that extended beyond medical necessity. The marriage arrangement, Doc Harper said finally. Tell me about the legal structure. Sarah described the contract her intended husband's family had crafted. Debt forgiveness in exchange for her hand, with provisions that essentially bound her to unpaid labor on their estate. Legal slavery wrapped in the language of matrimony. Doc Harper's expression darkened as she made notes. I've seen similar contracts. They're testing the boundaries of what territorial law will allow. She packed her instruments with careful precision, each tool returning to its designated place in the worn leather bag. You'll need legal representation, she said. I know someone who might help. The someone turned out to be Thomas Johnson, though everyone called him Bear. He arrived that afternoon driving a wagon loaded with supplies, his massive frame making even Zeke's sturdy cabin seem delicate. His dark skin bore the scars of old violence, but his eyes held the quiet intelligence of a man who had survived by thinking 3 moves ahead. Bear unloaded flour, salt pork, ammunition, and medical supplies without being asked. His movements spoke of military training, the efficient economy of a man who had learned to be ready for anything. Heard you got married in interesting circumstances, he said, accepting coffee from Sarah's hands. Also heard you might need friends. His voice carried the educated cadence that marked him as more than a simple laborer. Like Sarah, like Zeke himself, Bear was someone whose capabilities exceeded what the world expected from his appearance. What kind of friends? Zeke asked. The kind that don't run when powerful men make threats. Bear's story emerged slowly, shared in careful fragments between practical discussions of winter survival and legal strategy. Former Union spy, now blacksmith and community organizer, he had been documenting the activities of men like Harrison Steele and Cornelius Blackwood Sr. for years, waiting for the right moment to act. Haven Ridge isn't just a town, he explained. It's a fortress, legal, economic, social, built to last. As evening approached, their small cabin had become a meeting place for people bound by shared purpose, planning resistance to forces that sought to reduce them to property. The fire crackled between them, casting shadows that danced with possibility. Sarah moved to add wood to the flames, her sleeve brushing against Zeke's shoulder as she leaned forward. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent awareness through both of them. They were no longer strangers bound by desperate circumstances. Something deeper was taking root. Bear noticed the moment passed between them, his scarred face creasing into something that might have been approval. Marriage of convenience sometimes becomes something more, he said quietly. When people fight side by side. Doc Harper gathered her things, preparing to return to town before full darkness fell. Word is that Cornelius Jr. has reached the territorial capital. He's not coming alone. The warning settled over them like ice forming on still water. Their brief respite was ending. The real battle was about to begin. Zeke walked outside to see their visitors off, leaving Sarah alone by the fire. When he returned, she was holding a piece of torn fabric from her wedding dress, her fingers working the edges smooth. Second thoughts? He asked. She looked up at him, firelight catching the gold flecks in her dark eyes. About which part? The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to name. They had married for survival, but survival was becoming something more complex. Something that required trust beyond legal convenience. Any of it, he said finally. Sarah set the fabric aside and stood, moving to the window where frost painted intricate patterns on the glass. Outside, wind moved through the pines with the sound of whispered secrets. I've been running my whole life, she said. From men who thought they owned me, from laws that said they were right, from a world that measured my worth in terms of service to others. She turned back to face him, her expression steady despite the uncertainty that colored her words. For the first time, I'm not running toward something or away from it. I'm standing still and fighting. Zeke felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of grief that had held him frozen since Mary's death. This woman who had stumbled into his life half dead in the snow was teaching him that standing still could be its own form of courage. Then we fight together, he said. Outside a wolf howled in the distance, its voice carrying across the frozen landscape. Inside, 2 married strangers moved a little closer to the fire, a little closer to each other, preparing for whatever morning would bring. The ground beneath their feet was thawing, slowly but surely. Spring was still months away, but something was beginning to grow in the space between them, something worth protecting, something worth fighting for. Cornelius Blackwood Jr. arrived in town like a plague carried by expensive horses. His entourage filled the hotel's best rooms. His money loosened tongues that had previously stayed silent, and his presence cast a shadow over every conversation in every saloon and general store. Word reached the cabin through Bear, who had contacts in places where information flowed freely. The young Blackwood was everything his reputation promised: violent, entitled, accustomed to taking what he wanted, and destroying what resisted him. "He's offering rewards," Bear reported, his massive frame filling the doorway as snow swirled behind him. $50 for information about your whereabouts, $100 for anyone who brings you in alive. Sierra's hands stilled on the shirt she was mending. The needle caught firelight as she set it aside, her movements careful and controlled despite the tremor that ran through her shoulders. "He's not coming alone," she said quietly. "6 men with him, professional types, the kind that know how to make problems disappear." Zeke felt the familiar weight of his rifle against the wall, the solid presence of weapons that might need to become more than tools for hunting game. The cabin that had felt like sanctuary now felt like a trap, its wooden walls thin protection against the storm gathering around them. 2 days later, Harrison Steele arrived. The railroad baron rode into town with his own complement of hired men, his presence causing as much stir as Blackwood's had. Within hours, the two powerful men had formed an alliance that sent ripples of fear through the local population. Doc Harper brought news of their partnership, her weathered face grim as she shared intelligence gathered from patients too frightened to speak openly. "They're not just after you," she told Sierra and Zeke as they huddled around the cabin's fire. "This is about setting precedent, legal precedent that would strip rights from anyone they consider undesirable." The scope of their opposition was becoming clear. This wasn't simply about one runaway bride or one disputed land claim. Steele and Blackwood Sr. were using their children's grievances as a testing ground for broader oppression, a way to establish legal frameworks that could control entire populations. "Your marriage," Doc Harper continued, "represents something they can't allow to stand. Legal union between people they consider property challenges the entire system they're trying to build." Sarah stood and moved to the window, her reflection ghostly in the frost-covered glass. Outside wind moved through the pines with the sound of approaching judgment. "There's something else," she said without turning around. "Something I haven't told you about Cornelius Jr." The silence that followed carried weight that pressed against the cabin's walls. Zeke felt the temperature drop despite the fires. Warmth saw the way Sierra's shoulders tensed as she prepared to share a burden she had carried alone. "He tried to force himself on me before the marriage arrangement was finalized. Said he was just sampling what would soon be his anyway." Her voice remained steady, but her hands pressed against the window frame with enough force to whiten her knuckles. The assault had been attempted, not completed, but the threat had been clear. Cornelius Jr. saw her as property to be used at his discretion. "That's when I knew I had to run," she continued. "Marriage to him wouldn't just be servitude. It would be daily violence wrapped in legal protection." Zeke felt rage rise in his chest, hot and dangerous as forge fire. His hands curled into fists before he consciously relaxed them, channeling the anger into something more useful than fury. Doc Harper's expression hardened. "We need to document this. Official testimony that establishes pattern of behavior." "Will anyone believe a woman's word against his?" Sierra asked. "They will when we're finished gathering evidence." The conversation was interrupted by hoofbeats approaching through the snow. Zeke grabbed his rifle while Sierra moved to her firing position by the window. They had practiced this choreography until it became instinct to people moving as one unit against common threat. Reverend Clearwater dismounted. Outside, his horse steaming in the cold air, his face carried news that couldn't wait for social pleasantries. "They're pressuring businesses," he reported as he stepped inside. "Anyone who trades with you, anyone who offers support, faces economic retaliation. Some are standing firm. Others are caving to the pressure." The town was dividing along lines that had always existed but never been drawn so strictly. Those who believed in justice stood with the couple. Those who prioritized commerce over conscience aligned with the powerful. Interests that threatened economic punishment. "We need to know who we can trust," Zeke said. "The list is shorter than I'd hoped," Clearwater admitted. "But the people on it are solid. They won't break when pressure increases." December brought snow that piled against the cabin's walls, and Christmas that they celebrated with quiet ceremony. Sierra had used scraps of fabric to sew Zeke a new shirt. her stitches small and even, the work of hands that found peace in creation. He had carved her a small wooden bird, its wings spread in flight, its form emerging from pine that smelled of forests and freedom. They exchanged gifts by firelight, their fingers brushing as items passed between them. The contact lingered longer than necessary, both reluctant to break the connection that was becoming more precious than survival itself. "I never celebrated Christmas with a family before," Sarah said, her voice soft in the flickering warmth. "Neither did I not since Mary died." The admission hung between them, heavy with grief and possibility. They were building something together, brick by brick, moment by moment, a foundation that could support more than legal convenience. That night, Sarah braided Zeke's hair in the Cherokee style his mother had taught him as a child. Her fingers worked with gentle precision, weaving strands that carried the memory of traditions nearly lost to violence and displacement. "Your mother would be proud," she said as she finished the work. "Of what? Of the man you've become. Of the choice you made to save someone who had nothing to offer you in return." Zeke turned to face her, their eyes meeting in the firelight. "You had everything to offer, you just didn't know it yet." The moment stretched between them, fragile as ice forming on still water. Something was shifting in the space that had once been carefully maintained between two strangers. The ground beneath their feet was no longer frozen. Outside, wind howled with the voice of coming storms. Inside, two people who had married for survival discovered that they were building something that could last beyond the immediate crisis. Something worth protecting not just from external threats but from their own fear of hoping for more than mere endurance. The next morning brought word that shattered their fragile peace. Bear arrived before dawn, his horse lathered with sweat despite the freezing temperature. His face carried news that required immediate action. "Doc Harper made a discovery," he said, accepting coffee with shaking hands. "Your marriage arrangement wasn't just a debt transfer. It was structured as a legal precedent that would invalidate marriages between people they consider unfit to make such contracts." The trap was more sophisticated than they had realized. Sarah's forced marriage to Cornelius Jr. would have established legal framework for voiding unions based on racial or economic status. Their own marriage was both a wrench in those plans and a test case for the opposition they would face. "They're not just trying to reclaim property," Bear continued. "They're trying to reshape the entire legal structure of marriage and property ownership in the territory." Sarah set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, her movements controlled despite the magnitude of what they were facing. "How long do we have?" Federal marshals are being pressured to intervene, maybe a week before they arrive with papers that supersede local authority. The walls of their sanctuary were closing in. The intimate space where they had discovered love worth fighting for was about to become a battlefield where the stakes extended far beyond their personal happiness. But something had changed in the weeks since their desperate wedding. They were no longer two broken people clinging to each other for survival. They had become partners in every sense that mattered. United not just by legal convenience but by shared purpose and growing love. The storm outside was howling closer. Inside, they prepared to face it together, knowing that their small cabin held something powerful enough to threaten an entire system of oppression. Something worth dying for, something worth living for. The town split along fault lines that had always existed beneath its surface. Store owners who had traded with Zeke for years suddenly found their shelves too full for his business. Others, like Samuel right at the general store, nailed a sign to his door, declaring his establishment open to all paying customers regardless of outside pressure. Children stopped playing in the streets when certain men rode through. Wives hurried, their shopping, heads down, voices lowered to whispers that carried more weight than shouts. The community was choosing sides in a conflict that would define its character for generations to come. Doc Harper brought lists written in her careful script. Names divided into columns marked with simple symbols. Those who could be trusted, those who had already betrayed that trust, those still wavering in the wind that grew colder each day. 15 families standing firm, she reported, spreading the papers across Zeke's table. 8 businesses refusing to bow to economic threats. Not many, but they're solid. Sarah studied the names, memorizing faces she had seen in passing, voices that had offered greeting instead of suspicion. The inventory of allies was shorter than hope required, but longer than despair deserved. The opposition's strategy revealed itself through small cruelties. Sarah Mills, the schoolteacher who had publicly supported the couple's right to marry, found her teaching contract terminated without explanation. James Fletcher, who operated the livery stable and had provided grain for Zeke's horse at fair prices, discovered that his suppliers would no longer extend credit. Economic warfare waged against anyone who dared suggest that love might triumph over law, that human dignity might supersede property rights. They're making examples, Bear observed during one of his evening visits, showing the cost of resistance. But resistance hardened rather than crumbled. Sarah Mills began teaching children in her own home, parents bringing payment in eggs and preserves when coin ran short. James Fletcher found new suppliers through contacts in Haven Ridge, creating trade networks that bypassed traditional channels. The community was reshaping itself around principles that went deeper than commerce. New Year's Eve arrived with snow that fell in sheets, covering the world in white that reflected lamplight from cabin windows. Zeke and Sarah marked the passage of time with quiet ceremony, sharing a meal of venison and preserved vegetables, acknowledging the year that had brought them together and the uncertainty that stretched ahead. "What do you hope for?" Sarah asked as midnight approached, her voice soft in the firelit stillness. Zeke considered the question while wind rattled the windows and snow whispered against the walls. 6 months ago he would have said revenge. 3 months ago, survival. Now the answer required more careful excavation from the depths of possibility he had thought permanently buried. "I hope we get to choose our own future," he said finally, instead of having it chosen for us. The admission carried weight that had been accumulating through weeks of shared labor, shared danger, shared quiet moments when their hands touched while reaching for the same tool or their eyes met across the small space that had become their world. "I love you," Sarah said, the words falling into silence that received them without surprise. "Not because you saved me from the snow, not because you married me to keep me safe, because of who you are when no one is watching except me." Zeke felt something unlock in his chest, a door that had been barred since Mary's death. Love was a luxury he had convinced himself he could no longer afford, a weakness that made survival more difficult and loss more devastating. But love had found him anyway, growing in the spaces between necessity and hope, rooted in shared purpose and watered by quiet acts of daily courage. "I love you too," he said, the words carrying the weight of commitment that went beyond legal contracts or temporary arrangements. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." They kissed as the new year arrived, their lips meeting with tenderness that had been earned through trial rather than given as gift. Outside, wind carried the promise of storms yet to come. Inside, two people who had married as strangers sealed their union with choice freely made. January brought news that changed everything. Bear arrived with documents that scattered across the table in careful array, papers that told a story of corruption spanning years and reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. His massive hands handled the evidence with surprising delicacy, each sheet positioned to support the narrative he had been building in secret. "I haven't been entirely honest about who I am," he began, his scarred face serious in the lamplight, "or what I've been doing here." The revelation unfolded like a map of hidden country. Bear was more than a blacksmith and community organizer. He was a former Union intelligence officer who had spent the years since the war documenting the illegal activities of men like Steele and Blackwood Sr. Haven Ridge wasn't just a community of formerly enslaved families seeking freedom. It was headquarters for a network that fought systematic oppression through legal channels, gathering evidence that could bring down corrupt officials and their corporate allies. "We've been waiting for the right case," Bear continued. "Something that would expose the entire system they're trying to build. Your marriage provides that opportunity." The documents painted a picture of conspiracy that reached far beyond one runaway bride or one stolen ranch. Steele's land grabs were part of a coordinated effort to concentrate property ownership among a select few. Blackwood's marriage arrangements represented a systematic attempt to reduce freed people to a new form of bondage. "They've been testing legal frameworks," Bear explained, his finger tracing connections between seemingly unrelated cases, building precedents that would allow them to control entire populations through manipulation of marriage law, property rights, and territorial statutes. Sarah studied the evidence with the focused attention she brought to any complex problem. Her educated mind cut through legal language to grasp the implications of what they were facing. "This isn't about us," she said quietly. "We're just the case they're using to establish the precedent they need. Which means we have the power to stop them," Zeke realized. "If we can prove the conspiracy, if we can expose what they're really doing, the whole structure collapses." The strategy shifted from defense to offense. Instead of simply protecting their marriage, they would use it as a weapon against the forces that sought to destroy not just their happiness but the freedom of countless others. "What do you need from us?" Sarah asked. "Testimony, evidence." the courage to stand up in territorial court and tell the truth about what they've done. The risk was enormous. Speaking publicly about her experiences would expose Sarah to retaliation. Challenging Steele's land theft would put Zeke in federal crosshairs, but silence would guarantee the victory of men who saw human beings as property to be bought and sold. "We'll do it," Zeke said, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had found something worth dying for. That evening, as they prepared for bed in the space they had learned to share with comfortable intimacy, Sarah sat beside Zeke on the narrow cot that served as their marriage bed. Her fingers worked through his hair, braiding it in the Cherokee style that had become their nightly ritual. "Are you afraid?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the fire's whisper. "Terrified," he admitted, "but not of dying. Of living in a world where love like ours is considered illegal," she finished. The Braden moved to lie beside him, their bodies sharing warmth beneath blankets that smelled of pine smoke and hope. Their physical relationship remained chaste by mutual agreement, but the intimacy they shared went deeper than desire, rooted in trust that had been tested by fire and proven stronger than fear. Outside, wind carried the scent of snow and the promise of springs still months away. Inside, two people who had found each other in a blizzard prepared to face a storm that would determine not just their own future but the shape of justice in a territory struggling to define itself. The ground beneath them was no longer frozen. Something was growing in the space between winter and spring, between desperation and hope, between two hearts that had learned to beat in rhythm with each other. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new tests of the love they had built from necessity and choice. But tonight, they had each other and the quiet certainty that some things were worth fighting for. Some things were worth everything. The courthouse in the territorial capital rose from frozen ground like a monument to promises half kept. Its stone walls had witnessed the birth of laws meant to protect the vulnerable and the perversion of those same laws to serve the powerful. Now it would host a battle that would determine which vision of justice would prevail. Doc Harper spent 3 days coaching Sarah on testimony that could expose the conspiracy threatening to reshape territorial law. They practiced in the cabin's confined space, Harper playing the role of hostile attorney while Sarah learned to speak truth that men would try to twist into lies. "They'll attack your character," Harper warned, her weathered face serious in the lamplight. "Question your education, your motives, your right to speak at all." "Let them try," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the quiet steel of someone who had survived worse attacks than legal proceedings. Bear organized evidence into presentations that told clear stories of corruption, documents that revealed connections between seemingly unrelated cases, testimony from victims who had suffered under the system. Steele and Blackwood were trying to establish a web of proof that would be difficult to dismiss or explain away. Zeke faced his own preparation for the stand. His stolen land was evidence of the broader conspiracy, but testifying would expose him to federal charges for the cattle theft accusations Steele had fabricated. The choice between justice and personal safety carried weight that pressed against his shoulders during the long nights before their departure. The journey to the capital took 2 days through snow that fell steadily, covering their tracks as they traveled. Bear drove the wagon while Zeke rode alongside, rifle ready for trouble that might come from any direction. Sarah sat bundled in blankets that smelled of pine smoke and home, her hands steady on the pistol hidden beneath the wool. They were no longer the desperate strangers who had married in a blizzard. Months of shared danger had forged them into something stronger than the sum of their individual strengths, a partnership that could face whatever waited in the courthouse's formal chambers. The territorial capital was a collection of buildings ambitious enough to suggest permanence but humble enough to acknowledge their frontier status. The courthouse dominated the central square, its second-story windows overlooking streets where power was bought and sold with casual brutality. Steele waited for them there. The railroad baron approached Zeke on the courthouse steps, his expensive coat a stark contrast to the working clothes that marked most of the town's population. His smile carried the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through intimidation or purchase. "I have a proposition," he said, producing papers from his inner pocket. "Drop your testimony against my business practices. Convince your wife to do the same. In return, I'll restore your family ranch and drop all charges against you." The deed to Zeke's stolen land was right there, requiring only his signature to reclaim everything he had lost. The ranch where he had been born, the graves where his parents rested, the home where Mary had drawn her last breath while he held her hand and promised vengeance against those who had killed her through legal theft. 24 hours, Steele continued. That's how long the offer stands. He walked away before Zeke could respond, leaving the papers in hands that trembled with the weight of impossible choice. Justice for countless victims balanced against personal restoration. The greater good weighed against the specific grief that had driven him through months of bitter survival. That evening, in their shared room at the capital's only respectable hotel, Syrah watched Zeke study the deed that could restore his family's legacy. The document represented everything he had lost, everything he had fought to reclaim, everything that had defined his purpose before love had given him new reasons to fight. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral despite the stakes involved. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to take it, to stand in my parents' house again, to tend Mary's grave, to have something back that was stolen from me. And the other part..." Zeke set the papers aside and moved to the window that overlooked the courthouse square. Below, lamplight reflected off snow that covered the ground where justice would be decided. His reflection stared back from the glass, showing a man who had been transformed by love into someone capable of choosing principle over personal desire. The other part knows that some things matter more than property. The next morning brought news that shattered their careful preparations. Cornelius Jr. had grown tired of legal proceedings and due process. 3 witnesses reported seeing him near the hotel's back entrance before dawn, accompanied by men whose faces were hidden beneath winter scarves. His patience for retrieving his stolen bride through official channels had run out. Bear doubled their security arrangements, positioning allies at strategic locations around the courthouse. Doc Harper stayed close to Syrah, her medical bag supplemented by a derringer that could stop threats conventional healing couldn't address. The community they had built through months of shared struggle formed a protective barrier around the couple who had become symbols of something larger than individual happiness. The courtroom filled with spectators who understood they were witnessing more than a simple marriage dispute. Farmers who had lost land to railroad expansion, families who had watched loved ones disappear into legal arrangements that resembled slavery, citizens who believed that justice should serve people rather than property, sat alongside those who profited from the current system's inequalities. Territorial Judge William Crawford called the proceedings to order with a gavel that echoed off walls that had heard too many promises broken and too few kept. His weathered face revealed nothing of his intentions, but his reputation suggested a man who valued law over convenience, justice over Syrah took the stand first. Her voice remained steady as she described the marriage arrangement that would have bound her to unpaid labor disguised as matrimony. The legal structure that classified her as property to be transferred rather than a person capable of choosing her own fate. The attempted assault that had convinced her to flee rather than submit to a system that offered no protection for the vulnerable. The opposing attorney attacked with questions designed to undermine her credibility. Her education was questioned, her motives impugned, her right to make legal decisions challenged on grounds that revealed more about the questioner's assumptions than the witness's capabilities. Syrah answered each attack with calm precision, her responses demonstrating the intelligence and dignity that had attracted Zeke's love and earned their allies' respect. She was not a victim pleading for mercy, but a citizen demanding rights that law promised but society withheld. When her testimony concluded, the courtroom held the silence that follows truth spoken in the face of power. Zeke's turn came with awareness that his words could destroy or redeem everything they had built together. The stolen deed waited in his pocket, requiring only capitulation to restore his personal losses. The greater good demanded sacrifice that would leave his family's graves untended in his childhood home in the hands of thieves. He took the stand, knowing that some choices define not just individual character but the moral direction of entire communities. The moment of decision had arrived. Outside, snow continued falling on ground that would soon begin the slow thaw toward spring. Inside the courthouse, 2 people who had found love in a blizzard prepared to discover whether their society possessed the courage to choose justice over convenience, human dignity over property rights, hope over fear. The future waited on words yet to be spoken, choices yet to be made, courage yet to be tested in the crucible of consequence that would determine not just their fate but the shape of justice in a territory struggling to define its soul. The ground beneath their feet was no longer frozen. Something was growing that could survive the winter of oppression and bloom in the spring of possibility, if they had the strength to nurture it through the darkness that remained. Zeke stood at the witness stand with Steele's deed burning in his pocket. The paper represented everything he had lost, everything he had fought to reclaim, everything that had defined his purpose before love had taught him that some things mattered more than property. He pulled out the deed slowly, its legal weight heavy in his weathered hands. The courtroom held its breath as he unfolded the document that could restore his family's ranch, his parents' graves, his sister's memory housed in familiar walls. Then he tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper echoed through the silent chamber. Pieces fluttered to the floor, carrying with them the last temptation to choose personal restoration over collective justice. Some things matter more than property, he said, his voice carrying across the courtroom to where Sarah sat, with tears streaming down her face. My wife is my partner, not my possession. Our marriage is built on choice, not ownership. Judge Crawford leaned forward, his weathered face grave as he studied the man who had just rejected salvation for the sake of principle. You understand what you've done, Mr. Thornfield. You've destroyed your only chance to reclaim your family's land. I've chosen my family, Zeke replied, his eyes finding Sarah's across the crowded room. The one I built with my own hands and my own heart. His testimony laid bare the conspiracy that connected his stolen ranch to Sarah's forced marriage, the systematic corruption that sought to reduce human beings to property through legal manipulation. Bear's evidence supported every accusation, creating a web of proof that even hostile questioning could not unravel. When the prosecution finished their futile attempts to discredit testimony backed by documentary evidence, Judge Crawford called for recess. The courtroom emptied into winter air that carried the scent of change, the possibility that justice might triumph over expediency. Bear found Zeke and Sarah in the hotel dining room, their hands clasped across a table that held untouched food. The big man's scarred face wore an expression of quiet pride as he sat beside the couple who had risked everything for principles larger than personal happiness. Whatever happens next, he said, his deep voice carrying the weight of shared struggle, you've already won something more important than any court decision. The next morning brought Judge Crawford's ruling. The territorial court invalidated the debt transfer system that had bound Sarah to involuntary marriage. Federal marshals arrested Steele and Blackwood Sr. on charges of conspiracy and fraud that would follow them to federal prison. The legal precedent they had sought to establish crumbled beneath the weight of evidence and testimony that exposed their true intentions. Cornelius Jr., facing assault charges and the collapse of his family's corrupt empire, fled the territory before warrants could be served. His departure left behind the wreckage of schemes that had depended on legal protection for illegal activities. The courthouse steps filled with supporters who had gathered to witness justice served, farmers whose land had been stolen, families whose members had been trapped in legal bondage, citizens who believed in the possibility of law that served people rather than property. Their voices rose in celebration that echoed off stone walls, that had finally heard truth triumph over power. But the victory came with its own weight. Zeke and Sarah stood on those same steps, legally married and legally free, surrounded by allies who had become chosen family through shared struggle. Battle was won, but the war for justice would continue in courtrooms and communities across the territory. Their case had established precedent that would protect others, but implementation would require constant vigilance from citizens willing to fight for principles worth defending. What now? Sarah asked as they walked away from the courthouse, toward the wagon that would carry them home. Now we build something better, Zeke replied, his hand finding hers as they navigated streets that no longer felt threatening. We build it together. The journey back to their territory took them through Haven Ridge, where Thomas Bear Johnson had established a community that served as fortress and foundation for the ongoing struggle. The town had grown during their absence, new families, arriving to claim freedom that law had promised but only collective action could secure. Children played in streets that belonged to their parents rather than distant corporations. Shops operated by formerly enslaved people served customers who paid fair prices for honest goods. The school that Sarah would help establish was already taking shape, its frame rising from ground that had been bought with savings, pooled by families who understood the power of education to transform lives. This is what we were fighting for, Bear said as they surveyed the growing community. Not just your right to marry, but everyone's right to choose their own future. Zeke and Sarah made their decision that evening, sitting by a fire that warmed the cabin where they had first discovered love worth defending. They would not return to the isolated homestead where they had weathered the storm of opposition. Instead, they would help build Haven Ridge into something that could last beyond their own lives. The school rose through spring construction, its walls built by hands that had known bondage and chosen freedom. Sarah taught children whose parents had been denied education, her voice carrying across classrooms that represented hope made manifest. Zeke provided security for a community that faced ongoing threats from those who profited from oppression. but his role evolved beyond protection to leadership in the ongoing struggle for justice. Their home became a way station for refugees seeking freedom, a place where marriage certificates were honored regardless of the race or status of those who bore them. The love story that had begun in a blizzard became part of Haven Ridge's founding legend, proof that individuals could choose to build something better than the world they inherited. 6 months after the courthouse victory, Sarah stood in the doorway of their new home, her hand resting on the gentle curve of pregnancy that carried their future. The house they had built with their own labor was surrounded by gardens that would feed their family and neighbors, by streets where children played without fear, by a community that had chosen hope over despair. Zeke approached from the schoolhouse where he had been installing windows, his face bearing the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found purpose larger than personal grievance. Sawdust clung to his shirt, and his hands carried the honest dirt of construction work that built rather than destroyed. "The baby's moving," Sarah said, guiding his palm to where new life stirred beneath her skin. "I think it's going to be a fighter. Takes after its mother," he replied, feeling the flutter of possibility beneath his fingers. They stood together watching sunset paint the sky above Haven Ridge in shades of gold and amber, their love story reflected in the faces of children who would grow up free, in the voices of families who had chosen to build community rather than accept isolation, in the quiet certainty that some things were worth every sacrifice required to protect them. The storm that had brought them together had passed, but the ground it had cleared continued to yield growth. Hope was not something they had found in the blizzard. Hope was something they had created together, choice by choice, day by day, in the space between what was and what could be. Their marriage had begun as a desperate gamble against impossible odds. It had become the foundation for a future that extended far beyond their own happiness, a testament to the power of love to transform not just individual lives but entire communities willing to fight for justice. The cowboy had found the runaway bride in the blizzard and married her before dawn. Together they had found something more precious than safety, more lasting than legal victory, more powerful than the forces that had sought to destroy them. They had found hope, and they had built it into something that would outlast the winter, survive the storms, and bloom in the spring of possibility that stretched ahead. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story that. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel, and if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.